It was the last week of September 1991, one of those Georgia autumns that arrives without announcing itself. The heat still heavy in the afternoon, but something cooler underneath it by evening. The kind of air that smells like pine and red clay, and the particular sweetness of kudzu finally beginning to die back after a long summer. The town of Carver's Mill had been getting ready for its annual harvest festival all week. The church ladies had been baking since Monday. The high school band had practiced their parade route twice. And Nora Jean Whitfield had promised her sister she would be at the Friday night fish fry at First Baptist by 6 o'clock. Because Nora Jean, in 32 years of living, had never once broken a promise she made to her sister. She never made it to the fish fry. What happened to Nora Jean Whitfield on the evening of September 27, 1991, would hollow out a community that thought it knew itself, that believed, the way small towns sometimes do, that the worst things happened somewhere else. And it would take 32 years, a database that didn't exist when Nora Jean was alive, and a single investigator who refused to file the case away for good, to finally expose a truth that had been hiding in the most visible possible place, in the face of a man that Carver's Mill had trusted, respected, and grieved alongside for 3 decades. But before any of that, we have to go back to that September evening. Because to understand what this case cost, you first have to understand who Nora Jean Whitfield was, and what Carver's Mill lost the night she didn't come home. Carver's Mill sat in the red clay Piedmont of Middle Georgia, a town of roughly 8,000 people anchored by a textile mill that had been the economic center of the community since 1923. By 1991, the mill was struggling, the industry was struggling across the South, and everyone in Carver's Mill knew it, though most people preferred not to say it out loud. The town had the particular quality of a place that had been prosperous and was determined not to admit it wasn't anymore. The main street still had a jewelry store, a 5 and dime that had somehow outlasted the chains, and a barber shop where you could still get a haircut for $7 and catch up on everything worth knowing. The Friday night fish fry at First Baptist had been a community institution for over 20 years. Families came. Couples came. Old men came alone and sat at the long tables and talked about the weather and the Braves and whatever the mill was or wasn't doing. In September 1991, Georgia was in the grip of Braves fever. The team was on its way to its first World Series since moving to Atlanta, and the whole state felt like it was leaning forward in its seat. The fish fry that last Friday of September had a portable television set up near the serving line, tuned to the pregame. People were in a good mood. The parking lot was full by 5:30. Nora Jean Whitfield had lived in Carver's Mill her entire life. She was 32 years old, the middle of 3 sisters. Diane, the oldest, who ran a hair salon on Magnolia Street. Nora Jean in the middle, and Paulette, 7 years younger, who was still in college in Athens. Their mother, Louise Whitfield, had raised all 3 of them in the same house on Pekin Street where she still lived. A woman of enormous dignity and quiet force who had worked 30 years as a clerk at the county courthouse and who knew more about the official business of Carver's Mill than most of the officials themselves. Nora Jean had grown up in that house, moved out at 23 when she got an apartment of her own 2 streets over, and still came home for Sunday dinner every week without fail. She worked as a dispatcher for the county sheriff's office, a job she had held for 6 years, a position that put her at the center of everything that happened in Carver's Mill, whether she wanted to be or not. She knew the names of every deputy, every regular caller, every address that had come up more than twice. She was known for her composure during emergencies and for the dry, generous humor she deployed in the minutes between them. Deputy James Corley, who worked with her for 4 of those 6 years, would later say she was the best dispatcher he had ever seen. He said it the way people say things about someone they cannot believe is gone. She had a dog named Biscuit, a large, friendly, undisciplined hound of uncertain heritage who slept at the foot of her bed and ate anything left unattended within reach. She had a collection of country music cassette tapes organized alphabetically in a case beside her stereo, which her sister Diane considered eccentric and her mother considered entirely reasonable. She had been seeing a man named Carl for about 8 months, something casual enough that she hadn't introduced him to Louise yet, which in Louise Whitfield's household was a meaningful social distinction. On the evening of September 27th, Nora John left her apartment on Oak Street at 5:15. She told Diane she was coming to the fish fry and would be there by 6. Diane saved her a seat. She never filled it. By 6:30, Diane had called Nora Jean's apartment twice and gotten the answering machine. By 7, she had called their mother. Louise Whitfield called the sheriff's office directly, her daughter's workplace, where people knew Nora Jean by name, and within the hour the department had begun the particular terrible process of looking for one of their own. Nora Jean's car, a 1988 Ford Escort in Burgundy, was found at 9:14 p.m., parked on a gravel turnaround off Sawmill Road, approximately 3 miles east of Carver's Mills Center and 1.5 miles from the fish fry. The door was unlocked. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her cassette case was on the back seat, Reba McEntire on top, which her sister would later say meant she had been in a good mood on the drive over. The keys were not in the car. She was found the following morning in a wooded area 40 yards off Sawmill Road by a deputy following a search grid. She was 28 years old when she was hired as a dispatcher. She was 32 years old when she died. The manner of death was deliberate. The physical evidence collected at the scene included tire impressions in the soft clay at the turnaround, footwear impressions near the tree line, and biological evidence recovered from Nora Jean's clothing and from the surrounding area that was collected, processed as thoroughly as 1991 technology allowed, and submitted to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab. A DINA profile was extracted. It was partial, by later standards, but it was present. It went into CODIS, the National DINA database, when CODIS became operational in 1998. Nothing came back. The investigation was led by Sheriff's investigator Marcus Tatum, 44 years old, a Carver's Mill native who had known Nora Jean personally, who had been at the fish fry himself that night, who had heard the radio call come in and had driven to Sawmill Road believing, the way you always believe until you can't, that it was going to turn out to be something explainable. It wasn't. Tatum worked the case with a ferocity that his colleagues understood and nobody questioned. He had 2 persons of interest within the first 2 weeks. The first was Carl, Nora Jean's boyfriend of 8 months. He was cooperative, submitted a DINA sample voluntarily within 3 days of the discovery, and provided what could be verified of his whereabouts for the evening of September 27th. His DINA did not match the evidence profile. He was eliminated. He moved away from Carver's Mill in 1993 and has never returned. Which is what some experiences do to people. They make a place unlivable. The second was a man named Dennis Frick, a 29-year-old with a prior conviction for assault in a neighboring county who had been seen in the Sawmill Road area twice in the weeks before Nora Jean's death. Frick was questioned at length. He was hostile, uncooperative, and in possession of an alibi that was provided by a relative and could not be independently corroborated, which is not the same as having no alibi, and Tatum knew it, but it was not enough. Frick's DINA was obtained, eventually, through a court order. It did not match. By 1993, the case had no viable suspect. By 1995, it had gone officially inactive. Tatum did not accept that designation in any personal sense. He kept a copy of the case file. He ran the DINA profile through CODIS every year when the database grew. He requested it be resubmitted when enhanced extraction techniques became available in the early 2000s. He retired from the Sheriff's Department in 2007 and took the file with him. Louise Whitfield, for her part, did what she had always done. She organized. She kept a file of her own, every newspaper article, every piece of correspondence with the department, every letter she had sent to the GB and the State Attorney General, and eventually to the Georgia Cold Case Unit when it was established in 2012. She attended every community meeting where the case was mentioned. She was present, composed, and impossible to dismiss. She was the kind of woman who made officials feel the weight of their accountability simply by being in the room. By 1997, 6 years had passed. The Harvest Festival still ran every September, and Carver's Mill still gathered for the fish fry at First Baptist. But the Friday evenings were different now in a way that people felt and rarely said aloud. By 2001, the Five and Dime on Main Street had closed. By 2007, Marcus Tatum retired and removed the case file from the department and put it on the shelf in his home office, because that was the only way he knew to make sure someone was still responsible for it. By 2012, Nora Jean's dog Biscuit had been gone for many years, as dogs are. The apartment on Oak Street had been rented to 4 different tenants since Nora Jean. The burgundy Ford Escort had long since been returned to the family and quietly disposed of, because some things are too hard to look at, and that is a legitimate reason. The reward notice that had been posted in the window of the county courthouse, Louise had put it there herself, with permission, had been taken down in 2003 when the building was renovated. Louise had not replaced it. She had shifted by then to letters. Letters were more direct. She died in 2019. She was 81 years old, and she died without an answer. Diane still ran the salon on Magnolia Street. Paulette had come home from Athens eventually, had married, had children, and had become a middle school teacher. They called each other every September 27th. They did not call it an anniversary. That word belonged to happier occasions. They just called. They talked about Nora Jean. They did not talk about whether justice was coming, because by 2019 they had stopped expecting it on any particular schedule. They had just decided to keep expecting it, on no schedule at all, because the alternative was unthinkable. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like these, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now let's get back to Nora Jean. In March 2022, retired investigator Marcus Tatum, 75 years old, living in the same county where he had worked his entire career, received a call from the Georgia Cold Case Unit. A new submission of the 1991 CR 0441 evidence profile to an expanded forensic genealogy database had returned a familial connection. Not an identical match, a partial one. A cousin, twice removed, who had submitted their DNA to a public ancestry website looking for family history and had no idea their genetic information would one day reach back 31 years to a gravel turnaround off Sawmill Road. From that cousin, analysts had built outward through a family tree, narrowing by geography, by age, by gender, until one name kept surfacing as the statistically probable source. The analyst who made the call to Tatum was a young woman named Keisha Ford. She had been 11 years old in 1991. She had been working cold case DNA for 4 years. She told Tatum she had a name, and she told him to sit down. And he told her he hadn't sat down easily in 20 years, but he would try. The name was Roy Dean Alcott. Roy Dean Alcott was 60 years old in 2022. He had been 29 years old in September 1991, the same age as Dennis Frick, the early suspect who had been cleared. He had grown up in Carver's Mill. He still lived there. He had worked for 31 years as a maintenance supervisor at the county school district, responsible for the upkeep of 4 schools. A man whose face was known to every teacher and principal in the county. A man parents nodded to in the school parking lot without registering him, because he was simply part of the landscape of the place. He had attended Nora Jean Whitfield's memorial service in October 1991. He had shaken Louise Whitfield's hand and told her he was sorry for her loss. He had been 2 years ahead of Nora Jean at Carver's Mill High School. In 1991, according to records and interviews conducted during the 2022 reinvestigation, he had known who she was. Their social circles were not the same, but in a town of 8,000, the circles overlapped enough that his name had never once appeared in the original investigation. Not because he had a perfect alibi, but because nobody had thought to ask him. He was unremarkable. He was present. He was trusted. He had plowed exactly the kind of furrow that invisible men plow in small communities: steady employment, surface-level pleasantness, attendance at the right occasions. For 31 years, he had moved through Carver's Mill carrying what he had done as casually as his work keys. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from Roy Dean Alcott through a discarded coffee cup recovered from the trash outside a convenience store he visited 3 mornings a week. It went to Keisha Ford's lab. It came back in 11 days. It matched. The tire impressions from the clay turnaround matched his vehicle class. The footwear impressions matched a boot size consistent with his. The biological evidence from Nora Jean's clothing and from the scene, preserved through 3 decades in the GEB archive, matched Roy Dean Alcott. All of it. Every piece. Roy Dean Alcott was arrested on a Thursday morning in June 2022 at his home on Fieldstone Drive in Carver's Mill by Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents and a Carver's Mill sheriff's deputy who had been, 31 years earlier, a rookie on the night Nora Jean's car was found on Sawmill Road. He had been 19 years old then. He was 50 years old at the arrest. He had thought about that case his entire career. Alcott was placed in handcuffs in his driveway. His truck was in the driveway beside him, a late model pickup, the same kind any maintenance supervisor in any county in Georgia might drive. A neighbor across the street saw it happen. She told a local reporter she had known Roy Alcott for 15 years. She said she had never once felt uncomfortable around him. That was what made it impossible to hold in her mind all at once. Not the evil of it, but the ordinary texture of everything around it. Carver's Mill rearranged itself in the days after the arrest the way small communities do when the answer turns out to be someone they knew. There was disbelief. Of course there was disbelief. And then, as the details of the evidence emerged, a slow and sickening recalibration. People recalled what they had not known they remembered. The way Roy Alcott had been at Nora Jean's memorial, how he had stood near the family. The way he had mentioned her name once or twice over the years, casually, in the context of what a tragedy it had been. The way you can stand inside a lie for 31 years and nobody sees it, because nobody knows to look. Diane Whitfield was 64 years old when investigators called her. She was in her salon. She sat down on the styling chair nearest the door and stayed there for a long time after she hung up the phone. Her first call was to Paulette. Her second call was to the cemetery. Roy Dean Alcott was charged with murder in the first degree. He entered a not guilty plea. His trial took place in the spring of 2023. The DNA evidence was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, supported by the physical evidence from the scene and testimony from the analyst who had processed both the original 1991 extraction and the 2022 comparison. Court documents confirmed Alcott did not testify in his own defense. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was led from the courtroom without looking at the Whitfield family, who sat in the second row. Diane and Paulette sat side by side. The seat beside them was empty. They had left it empty for their mother. Nora Jean Whitfield was 32 years old. She had Reba McEntire on top of the cassette case, which meant she was in a good mood on her way to the fish fry. She had a dog named Biscuit, and a collection of tapes organized alphabetically, and a sister saving her a seat, and a mother who would spend the rest of her life organizing the evidence of what had been done to her daughter in the disciplined, dignified hope that it would someday matter to someone with the power to act on it. It mattered. It took 32 years, but it mattered. Marcus Tatum was at the sentencing. He sat in the gallery. He did not speak to reporters afterward. He drove home to the county where he had worked his whole life, and he made himself a cup of coffee, and he sat on his porch for a long time. He has not said publicly what he thought about during that time. He has said only that it was not enough, that justice at 32 years' distance is still justice, but it is not the same thing as justice on time, and the difference between those two things is something a family carries forever. Nora Jean Whitfield deserved the fish fry. She deserved the Braves game on the portable TV and the long tables and her sister's saved seat and all the ordinary Friday evenings that came after that one. She deserved to grow older in the town that raised her, in the job she was good at, with the dog at the foot of her bed and the tapes in their alphabetical case, and every unremarkable good thing that a life in a community can accumulate over time. Someone decided she didn't get any of that. He shook her mother's hand at the memorial. He went back to work on Monday, and he walked through 31 years of that community's life, carrying the secret of what he had taken from it, surrounded by people who called him by his first name and trusted him with their children's schools. The DINA did not forget. The archive did not lose the sample. The analyst found the cousin in the database. The retired investigator answered the phone. Truth has a longer memory than the people who try to bury it. What does it mean that a man can move through a community for 31 years, trusted and unremarked, after doing something like this, and that nobody saw it because nobody knew to look? Was the verdict justice for Nora Jean, or justice for her family, or both? Or something more complicated than either? And what would Louise Whitfield have said if she had lived to hear the name Roy Dean Alcott spoken in a courtroom? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. Justice found Nora Jean Whitfield after 32 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.